Salnis Blues by James Baldwin. I read about it in the paper, in the subway, on my way to work. I read it, and I couldn't believe it, and I read it again. Then perhaps I just stared at it, and the newsprint spelling out his name, spelling out the story. I stared at it in the swinging lights of the subway car, and in the faces and bodies of the people, and in my own face, trapped in the darkness which rolled outside. It was not to be believed, and I kept telling myself that as I walked from the subway station to the high school, and at the same time I couldn't doubt it. I was scared for Sonny. He became real to me again. A great block of ice got settled in my belly and kept melting there slowly all day long. While I taught my classes algebra, it was a special kind of ice. It kept melting, sending trickles of ice water all up and down my veins. But it never got less. Sometimes it hardened and seemed to expand until I felt my guts were going to come spilling out, or that I was going to choke or scream. This would always be at a moment when I was remembering some specific thing Sonny had once said or done. When he was about as old as the boys in my classes, his face had been bright and open. There was a lot of copper in it, and he'd had wonderfully direct brown eyes and great gentleness and privacy. I wondered what he looked like now. He had been picked up the evening before in a raid on an apartment downtown for peddling and using herring. I couldn't believe it. But what I mean by that is that I couldn't find any room for it anywhere inside me. I had kept it outside me for a long time. I hadn't wanted to know. I had had suspicions, but I didn't name them. I kept putting them away. I told myself that Sonny was wild, but he wasn't crazy, and he'd always been a good boy. He hadn't ever turned hard or evil or disrespectful, the way kids can. So quick, especially in Harlem. I didn't want to believe that I'd ever see my brother going down, coming to nothing, all that light in his face gone out, in the condition I'd already seen so many others. Yet it had happened, and here I was, talking to a lot of boys who might, every one of them, for all I knew, be popping off needles every time they went to the head. Maybe it did more for them than algebra could. I was sure that the first time Sonny had ever had horse, he couldn't have been much older than Lee's boys were now. Lee's boys, now, were living as we'd been living then. They were growing up with a rush, and their heads bumped up abruptly against the law ceiling of their actual possibilities. They were filled with rage. All they really knew were two darkness, the darkness of their lives, which was now closing in on them, and the darkness of the movies, which had blinded them to that other darkness, and in which they now vindictively dreamed at once more together than they were at any other time, and more alone. When the last bell rang, the last class ended. I let out my breath. It seemed I'd been holding it for all that time. My clothes were wet. I may have looked as though I'd been sitting in a steam bath, all dressed up, all afternoon. I sat alone in the classroom a long time. I listened to the boys outside, downstairs, shouting and cursing and laughing. Their laughter struck me for perhaps the first time. It was not the joyous laughter which, God knows why, one associates with children. It was mocking and insular. Its intent was to denigrate. It was disenchanted, and in this also lay the authority of their curses. Perhaps I was listening to them because I was thinking about my brother, and in them I heard my brother and myself. One boy was whistling a tune, at once very complicated and very simple. It seemed to be pouring out of him as though he were a bird, and it sounded very cool and moving through all that harsh, bright air, only just holding its own through all those other sounds. I stood up and walked over to the window and looked down into the courtyard. It was the beginning of the spring, and the sap was rising in the boys. A teacher passed through them every now and again, quickly, as though he or she couldn't wait to get out of that courtyard, to get those boys out of their sight and off their minds. I started collecting my stuff. I thought I'd better get home and talk to Isabel. The courtyard was almost deserted by the time I got downstairs. I saw this boy standing in the shadow of a doorway, looking just like Sonny. I almost called his name. Then I saw that it wasn't Sonny, but somebody we used to know, a boy from around our block. He'd been Sonny's friend. He'd never been mine, having been too young for me, and anyway, I'd never liked him. And now, even though he was a grown-up man, he still hung around that block, still spent hours on the street corners, was always high and raggy. I used to run into him from time to time, and he'd often work around to asking me for a quarter or 50 cents. He always had some real good excuse too, and I always gave it to him. I don't know why. But now, abruptly, I hated him. I couldn't stand the way he looked at me, partly like a dog, partly like a cunning child. I wanted to ask him what the hell he was doing in the school courtyard. He sort of shuffled over to me and he said, "I see you got the papers, so you already know about it." "You mean about Sonny?" "Yes, I already know about it. How come they didn't get you?" He grinned. It made him repulsive, and it also brought to mind what he looked like as a kid. I wasn't there. I stay away from them people. Good for you. I offered him a cigarette, and I watched him through the smoke. You come all the way down here just to tell me about Sonny? That's right. He was sort of shaking his head, and his eyes looked strange, as though they were about to cross. The bright sun deadened his damp dark brown skin, and it made his eyes look yellow and showed up the dirt in his hair. He smiled funky. I moved a little away from him and I said, "Well, thanks, but I already know about it and I got to get home." "I'll walk you a little ways," he said. We started walking. There were a couple of kids still lurking in the courtyard, and one of them said goodnight to me and looked strangely at the boy beside me. "What you are going to do?" he asked me. I mean, about Sonny. "Look, I haven't seen Sonny for over a year. I'm not sure I'm going to do anything. Anyway, what the hell can I do?" "That's right," he said quickly. "Ain't nothing you can do. Can't much help old Sonny no more, I guess." It was what I was thinking, and so it seemed to me he had no right to say it. "I'm surprised at Sonny, though," he went on. He had a funny way of talking. He looked straight ahead as though he were talking to himself. I thought Sonny was a smart boy. I thought he was too smart to get hung. I guess he thought so too, I said sharply. "And that's how he got hung. And how about you? You're pretty goddamn smart, I bet." Then he looked directly at me, just for a minute. "I ain't smart," he said. "If I was smart, I'd have reached for a pistol a long time ago. Look, don't tell me your sad story. If it was up to me, I'd give you one." Then I felt guilty. Probably for never having supposed that the poor bastard had a story of his own, much less a sad one, and I asked quickly, What's gonna happen to him now? He didn't answer this. He was off by himself someplace. Funny thing, he said, and from his tone, we might have been discussing the quickest way to get to Brooklyn. When I saw the papers this morning, the first thing I asked myself was if I had anything to do with it. I felt sort of responsible. I began to listen more carefully. The subway station was on a corner just before us, and I stopped. He stopped too. We were in front of a bar, and he ducked slightly, peering in, but whoever he was looking for didn't seem to be there. The jukebox was blasting away with something black and bouncy, and I half-watched a barmaid as she danced her way from the jukebox to her place behind the bar. And I watched her face as she laughingly responded to something someone said to her, still keeping time to the music. When she smiled, one saw the little girl. One sensed the doomed, still struggling woman beneath the battered face of the semi-whore. I never give Sonny nothing, the boy said finally. But a long time ago I come to school high, and Sonny asked me how it felt. He paused. I couldn't bear to watch him. I watched the barmaid, and I listened to the music which seemed to be causing the pavement to shake. I told him it felt great. The music stopped. The barmaid paused and watched the jukebox until the music began again. It did. All this was carrying me someplace I didn't want to go. I certainly didn't want to know how it felt. It filled everything. The people, the houses, the music, the dock, quicksilver hot barmaid, with menace, and this menace was their reality. What's gonna happen to him now? I asked again. They'll send him away someplace, and they'll try to cure him. He shook his head. Maybe he'll even think he's kicked the habit. Then they'll let him loose. He gestured, throwing his cigarette into the gutter. That's all. What do you mean? That's all? But I knew what he meant. I mean, that's all. He turned his head and looked at me, pulling down the corners of his mouth. Don't you know what I mean? He asked softly. How the hell would I know what you mean? I almost whispered it. I don't know why. That's right, he said to the air. How would he know what I mean? He turned toward me again, patient and calm, and yet I somehow felt him shaking as though he were going to fall apart. I felt that ice in my guts again, the dread I'd felt all afternoon, and again I watched the barmaid, moving about the bar, washing glasses and singing. Listen, they'll let him out and then it'll just start all over again. That's what I mean. You mean they'll let him out, and then he'll just start working his way back in again. You mean he'll never kick the habit? Is that what you mean? That's right, he said cheerfully. You see what I mean. Tell me, I said at last. Why does he want to die? He must want to die. He's killing himself. Why does he want to die? He looked at me in surprise. He licked his lips. He don't want to die. He wants to live. Don't nobody want to die, ever. Then I wanted to ask him too many things. He could not have answered, or if he had, I could not have borne the answers. I started walking. Well, I guess it's none of my business. It's going to be rough on old Sonny, he said. We reached the subway station. This is your station? He asked. I nodded. I took one step down. Damn, he said. Suddenly, I looked at him. He grinned again. Damn it if I didn't leave all my money home. You ain't got $1 on you, have you? Just for a couple of days, is all. All at once, something inside gave a threat to come pouring out of me. I didn't hate him anymore. I feel that in another moment, I'd start crying like a child. Sure, I said. Don't sweat. I looked in my wallet and didn't have $1. I only had a 5. Here, I said. That hold you? He didn't look at it. He didn't want to look at it. A terrible, closed look came over his face, as though he were keeping the number on the bill a secret from him and me. Thanks, he said, and now he was dying to see me go. Don't worry about Sonny. Maybe I'll write him or something. Sure, I said. You do that so long. Be seeing you, he said. I went on down the steps. And I didn't write Sonny or send him anything for a long time. When I finally did, it was just after my little girl died. He wrote me back a letter which made me feel like a bastard. Here's what he said. Dear brother, you don't know how much I needed to hear from you. I wanted to write you many a time, but I dug how much I must have hurt you, and so I didn't write. But now I feel like a man who's been trying to climb up out of some deep, real deep and funky hole and just saw the sun up there, outside. I got to get outside. I can't tell you much about how I got here. I mean, I don't know how to tell you. I guess I was afraid of something, or I was trying to escape from something, and you know I have never been very strong in the head. Smile. I'm glad Mama and Daddy are dead and can't see what's happened to their son, and I swear if I'd known what I was doing, I would never have hurt you so. You and a lot of other fine people who were nice to me and who believed in me. I don't want you to think it had anything to do with me being a musician. It's more than that. Or maybe less than that. I can't get anything straight in my head down here, and I try not to think about what's going to happen to me when I get outside again. Sometimes I think I'm going to flip and never get outside. And sometimes I think I'll come straight back. I tell you one thing, though. I'd rather blow my brains out than go through this again. But that's what they all say, so they tell me. If I tell you when I'm coming to New York and if you could meet me, I sure would appreciate it. Give my love to Isabel and the kids, and I was sure sorry to hear about little Gracia. I wish I would be like Mama and say the Lord's will be done. But I don't know, it seems to me that trouble is the one thing that never does get stopped, and I don't know what good it does to blame it on the Lord. But maybe it does some good if you believe it. Your brother, Sonny. Then I kept in constant touch with him, and I sent him whatever I could and went to meet him when he came back to New York. When I saw him, many things I thought I had forgotten came flooding back to me. This was because I had begun, finally, to wonder about Sonny, about the life that Sonny left inside. This life, whatever it was, had made him older and thinner, and it had deepened the distant stillness in which he had always moved. He looked very unlike my baby brother. Yet, when he smiled, when he shook hands, the baby brother I'd never known looked out from the depth of his private life, like an animal waiting to be coaxed into the light. How you been keeping? He asked me. All right, and you? Just fine. He was smiling over the face. It's good to see you again. It's good to see you. The 7 years difference in our ages lay between us like a chasm. I wondered if these years would ever operate between us as a bridge. I was remembering, and it made it hard to catch my breath. I had been there when he was born, and I had heard the first words he had ever spoken. When he started to walk, he walked from our mother straight to me. I caught him just before he fell, when he took the first steps he ever took in his world. How's Isabel? Just fine. She's dying to see you. And the boys? They are fine too. They are anxious to see their uncle. Oh, come on. You know they don't remember me. Are you kidding? Of course they remember you. He grinned again. We got into a taxi. We had a lot to say to each other, far too much to know how to begin. As the taxi began to move, I asked, You still want to go to India? He laughed. You still remember that hell? No, this place is Indian enough for me. It used to belong to them, I said. And he laughed again. They damn sure knew what they were doing when they got rid of it. Years ago, when he was around 14, he'd been all hipped on the idea of going to India. He read books about people sitting on rocks, naked in all kinds of weather, but mostly bad, naturally, and walking barefoot through hot coals and arriving at wisdom. I used to say that it sounded to me as though they were getting away from wisdom as fast as they could. I think he sort of looked down on me for that. Do you mind? He asked. If we'll have the driver drive alongside the park, on the west side. I haven't seen the city in so long. Of course not, I said. I was afraid that I might sound as though I were humoring him, but I hoped he wouldn't take it that way. So we drove alone, between the green of the park and the stony lifeless elegance of hotels and apartment buildings toward the vivid, killing streets of our childhood. These streets hadn't changed, though housing projects stripped up out of them, now like rocks in the middle of a boiling sea. Most of the houses in which we had grown up had vanished, and had the stores from which we had stolen, the basements in which we had first tried sex, the rooftops from which we had hurled tin cans and bricks, but houses exactly like the houses of our past yet dominated the landscape. Boys exactly like the boys who once had been found themselves smoothing in these houses, came down into the street for light and air and felt themselves encircled by disasters. Some escaped the trap, most didn't. Those who got out always left something of themselves behind, as some animals amputate a leg and leave it in the trap. It might be said, perhaps, that I had escaped. After all, I was a school teacher. Or that Sonny had. He hadn't lived in Harlem for years. Yet, as the cab moved uptown through streets which seemed with a rush to darken with dark people, and as I covertly studied Sonny's face, it came to me that what we both were seeking through our separate cab windows was that part of ourselves which had been left behind. It's always at the hour of trouble and confrontation that the missing remember ashes. We hit North Street and started rolling up Lenox Avenue, and I'd known this avenue all my life. But it seemed to me again, as it had seemed on the day I'd first heard about Sonny's trouble, filled with a hidden menace which was its very breath of life. "We're almost there," said Sonny. "Almost." We were both too nervous to say anything more. We live in a housing project. It hasn't been up long. A few days after it was up, it seemed uninhabitably new. Now, of course, it's already run down. It looks like a parody of the good, clean, faceless life. God knows that the people who live in it do their best to make it a parody. The beat-looking grass lying around isn't enough to make their lives green. The hedges will never hold out the streets, and they know it. The big windows fool no one. They aren't big enough to make space out of no space. They don't bother with the windows. They watch the TV screen instead. The playground is most popular with the children who don't play at jacks, or skip rope, or roller skate, or swing, and they can be found in it after dark. We moved in partly because it's not too far from where I teach, and partly for the kids. But it's really just like the houses in which Sonny and I grew up. The same things happen. They'll have the same things to remember. The moment Sonny and I started into the house, I had the feeling that I was simply bringing him back into the danger he had almost died trying to escape. Sonny has never been talkative, so I don't know why I was sure he'd be dying to talk to me when supper was over the first night. Everything went fine. The oldest boy remembered me, and the youngest boy liked him, and Sonny had remembered to bring something for each of them. And Isabel, who is really much nicer than I am, more open and giving, had gone to a lot of trouble about dinner and was genuinely glad to see him, and she's always been able to tease Sonny in a way that I haven't. It was nice to see her face so vivid again and to hear her laugh and watch her make Sonny laugh. She wasn't, or anyway, she didn't seem to be at all uneasy or embarrassed. She chatted as though there were no subject which had to be avoided, and she got Sonny past his first faint stiffness. And thank God she was there, for I was filled with that icy dread again. Everything I did seemed awkward to me, and everything I said sounded frightened with hidden meaning. I was trying to remember everything I'd heard about dope addiction, and I couldn't help watching Sonny for signs. I wasn't doing it of malice. I was trying to find out something about my brother. I was dying to hear him tell me he was safe. Safe, my father grounded. Whenever Mama suggests trying to move to a neighborhood which might be safer for children. Safe. Hell, ain't no place safe for kids, nor nobody. He always went on like this, but he wasn't, ever, really as bad as he sounded, not even on weekends when he got drunk. As a matter of fact, he was always on the lookout for something a little better. But he died before he found it. He died suddenly, during a drunken weekend in the middle of the war when Sonny was 15. He and Sonny hadn't ever got on too well, and this was partly because Sonny was the apple of his father's eye. It was because he loved Sonny so much and was frightened for him that he was always fighting with him. It doesn't do any good to fight with Sonny. Sonny just moves back inside himself, where he can't be reached. But the principal reason that they never hit it off is that they were so much alike. Daddy was big and rough and loud talking, just the opposite of Sonny, but they both had that same privacy. Mama tried to tell me something about this just after Daddy died. I was home on leave from the army. This was the last time I ever saw my mother alive, just the same. This picture gets all mixed up in my mind with pictures I had of her when she was younger. The way I always see her is the way she used to be on a Sunday afternoon, say when the old folks were talking after the big Sunday dinner. I always see her wearing pale blue. She'd been sitting on the sofa, and my father would be sitting in the easy chair, not far from her, and the living room would be full of church folks and relatives. There they sit, in chairs all around the living room, and the night is creeping up outside, but nobody knows it yet. You can see the darkness growing against the window panes, and you hear the street noises every now and again, or maybe the jangling beat of a tambourine from one of the churches close by, but it's real quiet in the room. For a moment, nobody's talking, but every face looks darkening, like the sky outside, and my mother rocks a little from the west. And my father's eyes are closed. Everyone is looking at something a child can't see. For a minute, they've forgotten the children. Maybe a kid is lying on the rug, half asleep. Maybe somebody's got a kid in his lap and is absent-mindedly stroking the kid's head. Maybe there's a kid, quiet and big-eyed, curled up in a big chair in the corner. The silence, the darkness coming, and the darkness in the faces frightens the child obscurely. He hopes that the hand which strokes his forehead will never stop, will never die. He hopes that there will never come a time when the old folks won't be sitting around the living room, talking about where they've come from and what they've seen, and what's happened to them and their kinfolk. But something deep and watchful in the child knows that this is bound to end. It's already ending. In a moment, someone will get up and turn on the light. Then the old folks will remember the children and they won't talk anymore that day. And when light fills the room, the child is filled with darkness. He knows that every time this happens, he's moved just a little closer to that darkness outside. Darkness outside is what the old folks have been talking about. It's what they've come from. It's what they endure. The child knows that they won't talk anymore because if he knows too much about what's happened to them, he'll know too much too soon about what's going to happen to him. The last time I talked to my mother, I remember I was restless. I wanted to get out and see Isabel. We weren't married then, and we had a lot to straighten out between us. There, Mama sat in black by the window. She was humming an old church song. Lord, you brought me from a long ways off. Sonny was out somewhere. Mama kept watching the streets. I don't know, she said, if I'll ever see you again after you go off from here, but I hope you'll remember the things I tried to teach you. Don't talk like that, I said and smiled. You'll be here a long time yet. She smiled too, but she said nothing. She was quiet for a long time, and I said, Mama, don't you worry about nothing. I'll be writing all the time, and you be getting the checks.